Really exciting to be here and to be accompanied by this incredible panel to be joined in this particular conversation. Is this mic working? Or is it?
Yes.
So we're here today to talk about sovereign AI, possibly with a slightly different lens to some of the wider debates about what that's meant. So obviously this kind of conversation has been growing significantly in recent years and is represented to different extents in different kind of jurisdictions. And a large part of that conversation has started with a kind of sovereign compute kind of discourse, with them then also being more recently conversations around sovereign LLMs, which obviously some countries have rather than the kind of major hyperscaler options. And there's obviously a lot of work by the UK government to think about sovereign AI, both in terms of its new sovereign AI fund and also some of the work it's done around developing domestic compute. But with part of what we're interested in talking about and getting into a little bit today follows on the back of a report that we launched a couple of weeks ago, post-deployment training and economic sovereignty. And what this report gets into is the fact that foundation models, which are integrated into software as a service and agentic solutions that are being introduced across the whole economy, make the codification of work processes and methods far easier than was ever previously possible. So without assuming that that means that it will be able to automate those work processes, there's definitely a higher level of risk in the kinds of insights from organisations that can be kind of secured. And as people work with these systems and as they're supported by the kind of different infrastructures of these technologies to kind of undertake different types of what might be called human reinforcement, those risks kind of compound and increase. And what the research sets out is that there is a kind of, we've heard a couple of times today about intelligent consumers and about whether or not businesses that are adopting these systems understand what those risks are to their own kind of firm operating model, let alone their workers. And largely we found that there isn't that kind of intelligent consumer existing in the ecosystem yet. And the risk of that could be that there's a kind of consolidation of this insight in a couple of companies. And this is obviously, these risks are exacerbated when you hear the news of the Anthropic model escaping its sandbox and being able to kind of break into the most cyber secure and best resourced industry in the UK, namely finance, when a lot of standard industries are obviously nowhere near that level of kind of security and provision. So I suppose that's a little bit of the interesting context, but very open to a much wider conversation today. I'm very excited to have this panel here with me. So Vidushi Marda is the Director of Ecosystem Building at Collaborative AI and also has been foundational in setting up Current AI, which you should all look up if you aren't already aware of it. Matt Davies is Economic and Social Policy Lead at the Ada Lovelace Institute. Lloyd is the Director of Advocacy at the Digital Public Goods Alliance. And Patricia Shaw, among many other titles which it would take too long to run through, is the Director of the Society of Computing and Law, and has also been a key contributor to our recent report in thinking about how individual rights protections as opposed to firm level or system level kind of governance factors play into this conversation. So, starting with Vidushi, how do you think the UK is faring in terms of AI sovereignty relative to other kind of jurisdictions, and how have you seen this conversation evolve? What are your first thoughts?
Thank you, Abby, and hello everyone. It's great to be in this room. So before I talk about how the UK specifically, in my view, is faring, I think it's worth taking a step back to say what are we actually talking about when we talk about AI sovereignty. I think even the term artificial intelligence, you ask 10 different people, they'll give you 10 different definitions, and we've heard this said many times, and I think the definitional ambiguity hurts certain communities and benefits others, so just calling that out firstly. Secondly, I think sovereignty, traditionally has been about like the authority of a state over a territory, and I think when it comes to digital technologies, we've heard the terms like data sovereignty for many years as well. I think in the AI realm, to me, it has 5 components, right? So firstly, it's not just about the state, it's about states and communities, including the communities that you talk about in this report, workers and firms, and communities more generally. Secondly, I think it's about the ability to shape, adapt, control, refuse, importantly, and govern technology. So it's about strategic autonomy And it's not just about access, and it's not just about the illusion of control, or we, have some sort of superficial access or ability to shape how AI systems are built, deployed, and used. I think when it comes to the UK specifically, it's no surprise to anyone in this room when I mention Palantir, for instance. It's been in the news for a long time. The fact that, there are partnerships being forged between companies who don't have to, respect and promote foundational rights in institutions and in countries, being given access to critical health data is obviously very problematic. I think especially with the data centers question also, we see a lot of big tech firms, were sold this sort of idea of, you need huge amounts of money for compute, and small compute will just not do it anymore unless you have $500 billion lying around. You just can't compete. I think that sort of narrative is also lending to those partnerships. And I think the UK is not the only country in the world that is forging those partnerships. I think with the UK sovereign fund, with 500 million towards UK startups, I think that's a really important first step. But the elephant in the room for me really is that even if governments have some sort of control, where do communities still stand, and whether those communities are companies, whether they're specific groups of people with specific needs. I feel like that is a question that is failing people, not just in the UK, but all over the world. And the last thing I'll say is, we think of AI sovereignty, I think, and when I say we, I mean in the mainstream, you think that unless you can control all aspects of the stack, if you can have the chips and the models and the compute and the energy and the expertise, that is the only way to be sovereign. And I think if we shift our frame from just physical control to actually meaningful autonomy and control, then we can think about, what does meaningful sovereignty look like, and does it really have to be at the scale and the speed that big corporations would have us believe is necessary.
Thank you. Excellent opening provocation. Hopefully we can come back to this idea of how different communities are serviced, and the fact that firms could be one of those communities. I think that's really interesting and generative point to pick up on. So coming next to you, Matt, what do you think the components of AI sovereignty are?
Thanks, Abhi. Is this on? Is that working now? Yes, that is working. Thanks, Abhi, and hi, everyone. I think, to build on what Vidushi was saying, I think it's worth starting by acknowledging the kind of plurality of different understandings of sovereignty we're seeing. It's become a bit of a shibboleth or keyword of AI policy in the UK, a bit like safety was maybe a few years ago. It's a magnet for resources, for political attention. It's advantageous to talk about your own interests or pet project as sovereign, because that is what's going to get those things. But then the risk, I think, is that we're seeing sovereignty defined in a bit of a loose way, and it's becoming all things to all people. I think the chair of the Science and Technology Committee in the House of Commons, Chiomura, recently said that out of several ministers who've come and given evidence to her committee, they've all given different definitions of sovereignty. So these are ministers of the Crown who can't agree on what AI sovereignty means. And I think that's really telling. I think we're seeing a spectrum of different definitions, of understandings, of components of sovereignty, ranging from this more kind of physicalist understanding that Vidushi just alluded to, maybe a more maximalist understanding. So onshoring to the extent possible of the AI supply chain and key inputs into AI, maybe even public or government provision of parts of the supply chain. We see talk about public LLMs and so on. And this seems rather demanding, or maybe even impossible in a lot of cases. And as Vidushi says as well, it's missing part of the picture. It's a bit narrow. On the other hand, I think we're also seeing some very loose and expansive understandings that see sovereignty maybe more through this lens of autonomy. So, meaning different things in different contexts, about having meaningful choice over how you deploy AI, who you use as a provider, and so on. And, I think there are advantages to this maybe more pragmatic understanding. but there are also risks as well, right? That sovereignty doesn't mean as much, and that we aren't able to think as clearly about the trade-offs involved here, right? So we might end up with, fairly ludicrous situations that we're actually seeing, right? Where government is investing in some cases, American companies, partnering with American companies, and it's saying it's doing so in service of building sovereign capability. That feels a bit like doublespeak to me. So I think we need to be careful that we have a more precise and concrete definition of sovereignty, even if that means restricting it to not mean everything we think is good. It doesn't have to do that work. We can care about community involvement, we can care about prosperity, we can care about the jobs footprint of different investments without trying to make sovereignty do all that work. And I think if we can separate out these things, we can have a bit of a more of a clear-eyed and honest discussion about the trade-offs.
Thank you so much. Trish, is this audible? Is this working?
No.
Is this one working?
Yeah.
Is it?
I think it was.
What, maybe we could just shout into
Yes.
them. I think maybe it's the voice behind it. So actually, Trish, before I come to you, just because I think this follows on quite nicely from Matt, John, at the Digital Public Goods Alliance, what's your take on this question of what AI sovereignty means, and what is it that you do in this kind of space across different jurisdictions?
Yeah, in terms of when we think about digital sovereignty, obviously it's become an incredibly hot topic with the current geopolitical environment that we have, in a way that I personally haven't seen before, where countries all around the world are becoming very aware that they're dependent on essentially two countries, the United States and China, to develop their technology. And what we advocate for at the Digital Public Goods Alliance is open source solutions that adhere to the Digital Public Goods Standard. That's a set of 9 indicators. Open source is one of them, but it's things like do no harm by design, privacy first, and a whole bunch of other safety features already embedded in that code. And that enables countries to maintain that ownership and control over their, not just the software, but digital public goods also cover AI models, they cover data sets, they cover open content, and that to them gives them a lot of freedom to exercise that sovereignty. So it means that they can choose to have, choose what to acquire. They're not locked into any particular vendor. They're having that ability to make those choices, not just about the products, but also the data that's feeding into them. Using open source also means that they're able to have their systems audited, including the training data using a digital public good, which, as we've heard like several times, at least in the sessions I've been to today, like that lack of transparency undermines trust, which undermines adoption or creates outcomes that we don't think are favourable, like the Dutch examples getting shown. I think the post office scandal, that could have been completely avoided if someone had just been able to analyse the code. And so all of a sudden this idea of sovereign tech through an open source digital public goods lens becomes much more open, because all of a sudden you get a better understanding of what sovereignty is. It's not just from a government standpoint, but a community's and individuals' standpoint as well. So they have the ownership and control over their data as well.
Thank you. So I suppose we've heard a little bit about this kind of the global lens, the different fragmented internal within a single government kind of political understandings of what this means. And then also maybe to just return to the introduction and the contributions that we made there, something that we have positive as related to economic sovereignty is that we need more attention to how work and know-how is being collected, incorporated and used to train models, and where that value distribution goes. Now, a core part of the contribution that you made, Trish, to that report was thinking about know-how and the kind of individual rights perspective, what existing legal protections there are. So now that we are kind of thinking about post-deployment training and the way that models are improved in workplaces as they're used in practice, what do we need to be thinking about?
Yeah, I want to think about it from the lens of the fact that we've just talked about sovereign AI and not really knowing what that is as a kind of strategy. We haven't got a clear legal definition of that at the moment. But equally, understanding that community aspect of why it matters, coming then to the worker, because the community that I was thinking about really is those individuals who are workers. thinking about not only the ability for the people and the firms when they're buying in these AI systems and the models that kind of feed into that, to understand how that appropriate transparency for the training data, but to recognise what it's then going to do for them, but what it's going to do to them. And that's where, for me, that we know in that post-training environment where we've got AI systems that continue to learn and continue to learn and continue to learn, and that they also can recode, as we'll start to see with more and more agentic AI being used, the ability for AI systems to recode themselves and adapt and adopt to the environment and to other agents, whether they be human or machine. We then see this plethora of data and metadata coming about just from the workplace. So this isn't just kind of initial knowledge that was put in and imputed for that training initially, but also, which may well have come from third parties originally, or may well come from your own coffers. But say it came from your own coffers, so you thought, oh, I'm in control of this, I know how this is being trained, this is on my own manufacturing floor data, this is on my own office data, this is on my computer and my servers, I'm keeping it on-prem, aren't I? And then you're using an AI service, which is a SaaS. And so part of that might be federated learning, part of that might be learning that comes from the edge, that comes from other models that sat elsewhere, maybe on servers in the US, maybe on servers in China. But the point being is, you've got workers who are imputing data all the time. Now, some of that will be actual firm knowledge, some of that will be classified as know-how that comes in from their work in the workplace. That's protected under confidentiality proceedings and confidentiality agreements. But some of that will be what you and I have all learned after our 10,000 hours of working experience. That expert way of working, our methods, our processes, the ways we just do things. And that's all in here, right? And, that's being captured now. And so this brings about a whole new way of explicit know-how being captured, but tacit know-how and unexplicit and unconscious know-how being captured in not just how firms operate and work, but how workers operate and work. And why this then becomes a strategic economic asset is because when that is learned, when that metadata is caught, and then potentially being able to be anonymised, because it could well be anonymous from the get-go, they might not be able to IDV to an individual person, so it's not kind of classified as personal data or personally identifiable information, it's just metadata input into how your ways of working. The real challenge of that is they can lift and lay that, put that in an agentic AI system, and that could be deployed anywhere, anytime, anyhow, 24/7, 365. So what you thought was potentially a unique job to you could now be manifold and multiplied. And whilst that's, we think, oh, that's great, if I'm deploying that in my UK PLC employment environment, wonderful, I can maximise that in my team. But if that is implicitly being taken abroad or put on servers abroad, and there's no real controls, because we've already heard from today and from the report that the procurement teams aren't interrogating how your data is being used. Your procurement teams aren't asking about your model refresh. Your procurement teams are not talking about your model swaps. So they don't know and don't have the transparency. So all this information is kind of metadata, is fingerprints, footprints, should you want to call it that, derived data and derivative data. They've all got wonderful names in some contracts. But who owns that? Where does that sit? How is that captured? And so the challenge is that's been built and being used to build other AI systems that are going to be sold back into the UK. So whether as it is, as our report has pointed out, that we've got startups that are great in the UK ecosystem, but then being invested in by the US or other countries with very great VC capability, or whether it's not even that, they don't have to go through the process of procuring a startup now. All we have to do is model and capture all the information that's going to be sat on their servers. And, I'm talking about this from an employment context, but this could be a healthcare context as much as anything, where our liver data, our lung data, our brain data is being held elsewhere, and people are going to be held to ransom for it. So, I think I'll just stop there. But the post-deployment training data is essentially capture of our information that we're inputting onto a time-by-time basis in real time, to then potentially put in an agentic AI and sell back to us from anywhere else in the world. It could democratise and level up the playing field for other countries as well, absolutely, get that. But if that's where we're now in a different space, where we're going to be being competed against for our own data from elsewhere, then we really need to be thinking about what policies, practices and procedures, particularly the rule of law, which we've heard from the previous panel as well, how we go about protecting ourselves a little bit better.
Thank you, Trish. So we've heard a little bit about the fact that that when we're talking about AI, really, if we want to get into a conversation about political economy, which is critical, we need to think about the whole stack and also the different kind of components that might be within that and the different types of machine learning, essentially, and or foundation models that are used in that context. But another kind of elusive concept, other than sovereignty, I suppose, is UK PLC. Like, if you try and find out what UK PLC is, you'll be looking at different ownership structures. But something that we do know that is relevant to this kind of conversation about post-deployment training is that the UK workforce, as a collection of people who will win or lose through the course of this kind of trajectory, many of them are contributing to the training of these systems in practice. Now, what Trish has highlighted is that the law is kind of uncertain in terms of how that know-how is legally kind of governed. Some of it will be trade secrets within organisations, some of it will be explicit intellectual property of their employer, some of it will be their own personal data, so governed under personal data regimes, some of it will sit in this other space of kind of know-how that has been less explored in terms of how that is codified, and there's this kind of new kind of legal question around that, and also then how it's transferred and regulatory arbitration, these other things. But if there was a wild dream that we could maybe capture some kind of dividend for the workers, and obviously in this context not in the UK, that this could be in other jurisdictions, from this, we might need to get past all of that complexity of all of those different legal regimes and how that's already segmented between worker and firm. And the concept of know-how as a kind of public good, as a digital public good, could be quite compelling in that context. To kind of, or would it? Over to you, John.
Yeah, thank you. I think what we're seeing is a bit of a paradigm shift. So in the last decade or so, the way that we view data has been very much from an individual rights lens. So you think of like my data, my choice, like GDPR, all that kind of thing. And I mean, that's very good from a privacy perspective, but when we're thinking about this era of sovereign AI, generative automation, all that kind of thing, it's sort of becoming a little bit insufficient for what we're aiming to do here. And that's in that we're viewing this through a relatively narrow lens of individual privacy here and what we need to protect, but we're missing the forest for the trees a little bit, and that the collective industrial intelligence of the UK is what can be unlocked here with sovereign AI. So moving towards a view of know-how as a digital public good, it's not just a legal shift, it's really a strategic necessity for economic resilience. And there are a few things that the UK could do in terms of putting this into action. So looking at the Sovereign AI Fund, it needs to be more than an investment in just compute. It needs to be an investment in context as well. So we're going from an individual rights approach where it focuses on preventing harm to an individual to know-how as a digital public good that's focusing on generating value for the economy. Under the individual rights approach, we've got fragmented, siloed data sets, unclear ownership, and then as a digital public good, it encourages the creation of high-density sovereign commons. Under the individual approach, again, we see the risks of data offshoring via consent loops, having that sold back to us, as Tricia was mentioning. And as a digital public good, it would mandate the local retention of strategic industrial logic. I think there needs to be a recognition that capability is communal here in the area that we're heading into. Moving into this collective know-how, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to abandon individual rights either. So under the DPG standard, which is maintained by us at the Digital Public Goods Alliance, there are three main indicators that actually protect those individuals' data rights and that know-how. And one of them is around mandatory legal compliance. So anything that's certified as a digital public good needs to demonstrate compliance with both domestic and international privacy laws, like GDPR, for example. We have an indicator on data privacy and security by design. So technical safeguards, things like pseudonymization. Wow, that's just rolls off the tongue. State-of-the-art encryption, robust authentication, things like that. Making sure that they're integrated into the core architecture by design at the code level. I mean, that it's not the end, but very much a starting point. And we also have an indicator about non-PII data extraction as well. So our standard really encourages the extraction of non-PII information. And that's really like the sweet spot here for sovereign AI. So I think we're moving again from that idea of like individual control to moving to individual protection and collective utility. Moving from an idea that data is a liability that needs to be guarded to data is an asset that can be safely shared. The idea that compliance, like right now, it's often thought of as an afterthought or a checkbox or something that we're adding on at the end. But really, like, as a digital public good, privacy is fundamental in order to be certified and end up in the DPG registry. So yeah, I think like really what we're thinking about here is like not who owns the data and how do we use that for building out sovereign AI, but how do we use this to build the collective good.
Thank you, John. That was. I wish I had a recorder. we captured this info. I wanted to just open before I can. I will be giving further probing interrogations, but also I wanted to just allow you guys to potentially respond if you have any reflections on the conversation so far, and make sure that there are mics to do that. Maybe, yeah.
Can I just add something? Sorry, I think we've hit the nail on the head in terms of collective and collective meaningful understanding, collective rights, collective redress. I think this is a truly a collective problem, particularly one that's perhaps of a shared responsibility between the firm and the worker, because know-how really sits within this very unique space that is neither potentially personal data, it's potentially not, but equally, or it probably could be actually if it's in your mind and it's kind of mental data and it's something you're thinking about, but it's not your classic thinking about what personal data artifact is. And in any case, it was anonymised. That gets around the data protection law, but doesn't get around the issue that actually your worker is being displaced through that know-how. So I think that there's a potential need for a full stack understanding of the impact of this sovereignty or the lack of sovereignty in recognising both the data layer, the inference layer, not just the infrastructure, in terms of compute power and chips, etc., but also recognising that we need commensurate literacy amongst our workforce, which has already been mentioned. I would also say about literacy amongst our regulatory layer, because if we are going to make this a sectoral kind of approach in the UK, then we need to have regulators that have competence, capability, capacity, budget and powers to be able to enforce the law that's in their hands. And that law does need enforcing because of the fact that we've already seen from the previous panel on stage that, with the Luddites, it was a lack of enforcement of existing laws that meant that the guilds weren't being upheld.
Thank you, Trish. I just want to ask a specific provocation that I can't help on the back of that, even though also just feel free to respond to something else. But just coming to you, Matt, because of the things that I think relate to space, and also on the back of what you said, Trish. I'm curious about whether or not the next stage of this kind of move from a sense of liability to an asset and achieving collective value, which I really like as a framing. I think it's got a lot of potential. Whether or not the answer is more thinking about individual rights protections, not that I want to abandon them, or whether or not it's a kind of industrial strategy kind of approach that's then thinking about these architectures that mediate that value in the economy and then moving back into that kind of realm. So I don't know, maybe with that in mind, just Vidushi and Matt next. Yeah.
Is this one?
It's on, you just kind of have to yell into it.
There we go. Okay. Hopefully I'm yelling enough. Yeah, well, maybe I'll speak to something that I think relates to that. It was actually sparked by something that was said earlier, this issue of the flow of value kind of going out of the country and, perhaps kind of contravening or going in the wrong direction from the point of view of sovereignty. So I think a really important context for this that we've kind of touched on once or twice is the public sector and the role of partnerships with the hyperscalers and the big AI companies here. We're seeing government, after kind of fleetingly sort of experiment with maybe doing a bit more in-house and building a bit more capacity, pivot back to working with the companies in quite an aggressive way, signing partnership agreements, to set up pilots to quote-unquote explore opportunities, and really use the UK public sector as a test bed and as an opportunity for effectively their products. And I think this raises a lot of related questions to those that Trish has brought up. There are also questions around oversight and scrutiny. Often these partnerships take the form of MOUs with very little transparency, or the traditional mechanisms of oversight that would come through an ordinary procurement process. Again, not to say that traditional procurement is necessarily, fit for purpose here, but it's kind of bypassing that, right? And look, and this maybe does speak more towards your question, Abby. I think there are things that we need to think about to actually retain more of that value and ensure that if we are having these partnerships, if we think it's the right thing to do to partner with US companies, that we absolutely need the most kind of frontier, cutting-edge capabilities. I'm not convinced we always do, but for argument's sake, if we do think we need them, we need to think about conditionality on those agreements. We need to think about the retention of value and IP. We need to think when we're investing in companies, such as the Sovereign AI Fund, about taking a public stake, right? We need to think about the levers that the public sector can actually use to keep control and influence over these things if we're giving up capital and in some cases opportunities to them. So maybe that touches on some of the questions you brought up.
Absolutely, thank you. Vidushi?
I can't really. There's so many things to say based on everything that's been said already. The first one I want to talk about is something that's been coming back to me throughout this panel is that in 2015 we were talking about smart cities in exactly the same way that we're talking about AI right now, in that we were talking about how companies like IBM created demand for something that they wanted to supply. They went around traditional procurement safeguards, which aren't perfect to begin with, but they went around that by going to governments in the Philippines and in India and saying, we're not even going to take 1 rupee from you, so this doesn't trigger a procurement process. We'll give you free technology and digitize and make efficient your terrible public services for a period of 5 years, and then if it works, you can think about whether you want to work with us or not. And over the 5 years, it wasn't called post-deployment training data then, but it is now. And it's essentially the same questions that we're asking ourselves, which is, if you're in a hurry to get onto the AI bus and you don't ask important questions before you get on the bus, what is the price of that ticket really, even if you didn't pay money for it? And it's I think, even more aggravated now, in 2026 because of the sheer scale of investments and also of the dependency that has been sort of built up with these technologies. The second thing I wanted to say was that something Matt said I think is really important is that we don't need sovereign AI to do a lot of work with the definition, in that just because we are building sovereign tech doesn't make it tech that actually serves the public interest. So we shouldn't be thinking about sovereign AI as a panacea to actually asking questions like, do we need this technology? Who will it hurt? Even if it's perfectly sovereign, could it still be hurting some communities? And there's a foregone conclusion there. I think that as long as we can shape and control systems, we should just go all out. And I would argue actually that is how you replace one bad thing with potentially a worse thing. And so in this question of sovereignty, I think talking about what is the North Star? Who are we building for? What are the safeguards? What are the standards that we want to adhere to is almost as important as asking about asking the question about sovereignty.
Amazing, love that. Now, I have more questions, but I'm also greedy. Can I get a sense from the audience? Put your hand up if you'd like to ask a question so we can see how much we should dedicate the time to that. Yeah? Okay, there's a couple, and that always means there's a couple more that are feeling shy because it hasn't cracked yet. So okay, I'm gonna hand the floor to the audience. And would you like to just stand up and shout as the microphones are about as effective?
I'm not going to be standing up and shouting for you. Where's the balance? Because I think you mentioned that there might be huge potential for democratisation if it were to be shared, and if it were done already in the UK, we'd be profiteering from it, and yet actually if you send it somewhere else, they might be able to make good use of it. I'm not saying that's right, I'm just saying, is there a balance, and is there something to do with labelling what is protected and what is not protected, and finding a way of using it better? I'm looking at you because
I think we're finding and have seen that the benefits of technology deployments have been unequally distributed, and we'll be going against the flow of a river, I think, by trying to say how that would be democratised going forward, because there's this kind of way of working that's flowing outwards. But that doesn't mean to say it's not completely irreversible. I think there is potential for it to be changed. I think it requires, top-down and bottom-up approaches. Top-down in the sense of, a full stack lensed approach to what does it mean to be protectionist, for the UK, but bottom-up as well to recognise how we can have a literate workforce and what it is when the literate workforce is expending know-how. I think we would need to have a lot more control and a lot more oversight over how the information is shared, the know-how is shared, and what it was feeding into. And to have that, we need traceability, not just transparency. And at the moment, we do have traceable technologies such as distributed ledger technology, but that isn't currently in the discourse of how that stack would look like for training a large language model or training machine learning on an ongoing basis, and how we can essentially credential what that has learnt and take that elsewhere. It would need quite significant infrastructure change technologically to be able to manage that. But I think it's something we should be considering. I think a lot of nations, as we've heard about earlier on, are thinking about sovereignty for themselves. What does it mean to join up and to quote-unquote Carney from his wonderful speech at Davies? What does it mean for the middle powers to get together and to share and to do that so intentionally?
Thank you, Trish. If I can also just maybe come in with a reflection about where we are at a moment and the potential in that. In 1998, the US began to push and then managed to keep within most unilateral trade deals the exemption on algorithmic transparency and restrictions on data flows. And over the last kind of decade, the rise of privacy regimes which protect a certain type of data, which, as we've covered, isn't the entirety of data that would be relevant to know-how collection by post-deployment training or other mechanisms. In 2023, the US stopped pushing that kind of as a unilateral WTO kind of agenda, and that has been read in different ways, partly because of different types of pushback and also partly because it didn't necessarily serve their interests in their relationship with China. So I think that that presents an opportunity moment, which, if combined with a kind of collaborative middle powers discourse about know-how as a digital public good, it could potentially be a leverage point to think about new types of benefits, but that would need to be as there's now kind of bilateral agreements that are thinking about this and that are changing in those structures, those cooperations between nation states who also have very different regimes in how this might be governed anyway, becomes increasingly kind of important, but it is an opportunity moment because that kind of hegemony of the WTO exception has come to an end. Would you like to go next in the shouting arena?
Yeah, sure, I can do it. So sovereignty is about obviously control, and that, I think, I wanted to try with a question to create a little temporary autonomous zone for you to have sovereignty over discourse. Sovereign AI is kind of, we have to talk about it. It's kind of in the air as like a phrase, but of course it has its own history, and started off, or was definitely heavily pushed by NVIDIA. It's mixed up by a bunch of different people, so it brings a lot of baggage with it, and might hamstring us in some ways, create opportunities in others. But I'm wondering for people here whether you feel like the term is helpful or not for you in aggregate, and if you had to pick another word to focus on that might be more precise, that best describes the thing that we need to coordinate around, what might that word be? Thank you.
Okay, let's start with Vidushi and go across the panel.
Thank you. That is an amazing question. I will say it's a funny thing in our field where terms are brought up and sort of legitimized by entities or people who have a lot of power, and then suddenly you have to feel that term. So, for instance, when AI safety as a field came about, they said, we're not the AI ethics people, and they were pointing in a direction that I was standing in. I'm not an AI ethics person, but now you've labeled me one, so now I have to sort of debate my way out of it, right? I do think sovereignty is a little bit like that, in that, when we talked about data sovereignty, when data protection legislation was top of mind for everybody, the countries that always asked for data sovereignty were China, Russia, and India. And it was always talked about as you're being a reductionist, you're being outdated, how can you think about sovereignty in this day and age? And now suddenly sovereignty is the thing that we all want. So I think firstly, just recognizing the baggage of who came up with the term and why we have to respond to it is really important. The second thing is, though, and this is the same thing for me with AI safety, if a term isn't going away, and for better or for worse, people with more power, resources, and access to the media legitimize the term on their own terms, you have to fight back. And this is sort of an argument that I think we would have in every kind of workshop within civil society, within philanthropy, to say, should we come up with our own terms? Should we just ignore the term? Should we redefine the term? So I don't think there's a perfect way to do it. All of that being said, if I had to, not talk about sovereignty, I would talk about autonomy. I would talk about meaningful inclusion of communities, but not even inclusion as a design choice, but as a fundamental reason for why technology should be built in the first place. But clearly I need a branding agency to help me come up with something that actually sticks. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. It's a great question. I think, first I agree with everything Vidushi said. And I think, another angle to this as well is obviously it just means different things in different countries, right? So particularly there's a global north and global south divides over this, where, most countries are subject in terms of AI to some sort of extractivist practices or relationships, largely perpetrated by US companies, right? And increasingly the US state. But it obviously takes on a very different dimension when we're talking about the global south relative to the global north. So in terms of, what we should talk about instead, this is maybe a bit of a fudge, but I don't think there's one thing, right? I just think it depends on what we're interested in, right? So if we're interested in, as the Sovereign AI Fund will say on its vibe-coded website, having more, UK-based founders and unicorns and so on, great, fine, let's talk about prosperity, let's talk about an industrial strategy, let's talk about UK competitiveness, right? If we're interested in, consumer and business and public sector choice of suppliers, let's talk about competition and competitive markets, and let's consider doing some things that maybe the companies wouldn't like, right? Let's consider the CMA actually taking action in some of these the relevant markets. We can think about other things, right? Public AI, of course, very contested term, but I think there's a bit of a clearer steer there in terms of, at the very least, we might think about public resources being used. We might think about public or state-run operation or some sort of arm's length entity, right? And we're seeing this with AI research resource. And these sorts of initiatives might be useful if we're thinking about the need for preferential access for researchers, for example, to certain AI resources like compute or data. We could talk about cooperative or worker-led AI if we're thinking about, workers retaining the benefits, maybe the data, the know-how, and so on. For AI systems that are deployed at a either by them or with them or on them. There are many that opens the way to thinking about different sorts of policy solutions as well, right? Something I'm a big champion of is the TUC have long been calling for a worker reciprocity right for data, right? We could think about how this interestingly applies to maybe the know-how thing as well. So I don't have one single answer to your question, but I think it's all downstream of what we're trying to actually achieve.
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. Good question. I'll just start by saying we're kind of in this stage now where every problem feels like AI will have a solution for it, and actually not every problem needs AI to solve it. And so I think if we collectively can move out of that mindset, we'll be in a much, much better spot instantly. But ultimately, this idea of sovereign AI, because of this lack of consensus around what sovereign or sovereignty means, or it means so many different things to different people, I think I don't particularly like it as a term. But if we focus in on those, some of those core things that we're talking about in terms of that ownership, the control, the ability to switch vendors, not being locked in, all of that kind of thing, there are a few things that we can do, and maybe public AI is the best term, and public being for the public benefit, not under public ownership, if we think of it in that kind of way. But I've been sort of thinking about this in a way of the governance of an AI solution. I think when we talk about AI as well, we're also thinking of these extremely resource intensive large LLMs, and really there's this idea of frugal AI, which is kind of coming out, which are much more low resource, can be spun up by anybody, there's no exclusion to other developers, much more accessible, all that kind of thing. So I think if we're looking at the governance in a way that explicitly addresses the concentration of power in the AI industry, the exploitative practices that come from that, particularly regarding data collection and even labour, particularly in low and middle income countries, the economic and ecological impact. So, accounting for that massive computational requirement and a lot of the time, environmental costs, advocating that for those frugal AI approaches, and looking beyond openness as well. Openness doesn't guarantee equity on its own. If technology companies continue to benefit disproportionately from open resources, while local developers face massive resource constraints, and we're not in a solid position. We're kind of just moving to a different paradigm with AI as a frame. So I think there's a good opportunity for us to reclaim AI for the public interest, whether it's called sovereign AI or public AI. If I'm being totally honest, I don't really care what the term is. I'd rather we just get it done.
Yeah, I can't agree more with everything that's just been said by every one of the other panellists, so thank you very much. But I kind of feel like what was sovereign AI, or what is sovereign AI trying to address? And would we still been having this conversation had we not, had a fractious, perhaps, relationship with our ally on the other side of the pond? I feel like it's really meaningful for us because actually a lot of the sovereign AI discussions are about economic growth. And that's been reaffirmed throughout the day, I believe. But what we have heard as a mantra for the UK in terms of growth strategy is that we want to be makers of AI rather than takers of AI. And as we mentioned earlier on, this post-deployment training aspect essentially works as an extraction policy for us. So actually we're not being the makers of AI that really the sovereign AI wants us to be. So not in the way that in a long-standing, beyond the start-up, creating that long-term economic growth. But if I were to change the mantra slightly of what sovereign AI is or should otherwise be called, I'd much prefer to be thinking for us to be talking about inclusive AI and democratised AI. And then we can have some proper discussions, not just about the geopolitical gameplay that we've got between borders, but actually what it means to you and I, to individuals, to groups of collective workers, and to communities, those who are genuinely going to be impacted and affected by AI. And I think what would be really good to see out of this conversation and maybe out of our paper would be a greater conversation about how we bring about that collective discussion, how we think about collective rights, whether it be in a public good sphere or either in a more unique local sphere for that employment context. But there are opportunities for us to use the existing law, but I think we do need to have a good conversation with regulators to think about, even if they roll out the existing laws, what kind of capacity and competence they've got to do that to really maintain rule of law, because I think that's really been the issue and the heart and nub of economic growth issue. Because if we had economic growth and the ability to grow economically out of sovereign AI in the current mantra, then surely we would have been able to rely on our existing partners and to continue as we were. But clearly we don't. So if that's the case, how do we get that growth, maybe from a much more grassroots level, really bringing all those collective voices so we've got that diversity in the room from our workers and our communities are going to be impacted and affected. So I think there's a real opportunity there for us to think about how regulation could work better for those on the ground who are impacted and affected.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trish, and thank you to the whole panel. I won't be making any final and conclusive statements on what I prefer the discourse to be, but definitely take away homework from this panel in terms of thinking about how we would begin to shift the discourse from liability to asset in relation to work and know-how, what sovereign, maybe perhaps wealth funds as opposed to these other kinds of architectures might look like, and building momentum around know-how as a public good across borders, what the kind of considerations would be in that sense. Thank you very much to this excellent panel. Please join me in giving them the appropriate appreciation for their incredible contribution.